Genovese, and throughout the 1970s, the crime family operated quietly, infiltrating every possible aspect of life in New York City. In the construction industry, they corrupted various labor unions so they could shake down contractors whenever they chose.
They could threaten contractors with work stoppages and slowdowns unless you made kickbacks to them, or unless you allowed them to get in on rigged bids.
Along with the Gambino family, they controlled the city's private garbage collection industry, forcing businesses to pay their inflated rates.
That meant that there was a shakedown or unseen tax on every store, delicatessen, restaurant, office building, any private institution that had to have its garbage picked up by carters in New York were paying a tax.
By 1980, the man widely believed to be running the family was a no-nonsense gangster in his late 60s named Fat Tony Salerno, who kept a shabby apartment in East Harlem and did not wear fancy suits or drive around in a limousine.
His principal focus was to make as much money as he could illegally with the least amount of fuss. Under his leadership, the Genovese family, I think in many ways was the most powerful family in the country in terms of its domination of and exploitation of labor unions and legitimate businesses.
In keeping with his low-key image, Salerno conducted family business out of a rundown social club in his East Harlem neighborhood. But what Fat Tony did not know was that the FBI had placed a bug in his club. The bug in Salerno's club picked up crime family members confirming the existence of the mafia. Surveillance such as this became key evidence for a trial in 1986 that would prove in court what law enforcement had known for decades, that there was a ruling mafia commission and that the leaders of the crime families ran it.
They were very disciplined in the way they went about criminal activity. I mean, the commission had existed for 50 years, and it had existed precisely to lay down the rules for the American mafia and to adjudicate the disputes and to be the kind of final court of last resort in terms of authorizing certain types of murders. And because everybody in the mob respected the authority of the commission, they really had the ability to control all of these disparate criminal activities.
The surveillance tapes revealed that Salerno, along with commission leaders Paul Castellano of the Gambino family, Carmine Persico of the Colombo family, and Tony Corallo of the Lucchese family, had been taking kickbacks on big concrete jobs throughout the city.
They pooled all of their control of the construction industry in Manhattan. They would decide which companies would get to work on which jobs, and they agreed to divide among themselves a 2% kickback on every concrete contract of a value of over $2 million.
At trial, the wiretap evidence was so overwhelming, the defense felt it had no alternative but to concede for the first time in the history of American justice that in fact there was a mafia.
What you had was various defendants on unrelated wiretaps or bugs making the same references to the so-called commission. So it put us in a very, very difficult position, and I know it's something we did reluctantly, but I thought it was something that if we had any shot to win the trial, we certainly weren't going to be able to litigate.
The defense strategy failed. In November 1986, the jury found all the defendants guilty. Fat Tony Salerno received a 100-year sentence.
A jury has now determined beyond a reasonable doubt that there's a mafia commission, and that these men ran it and committed heinous crimes as part of that ruling body. Every single defendant was convicted on every single count, and I think this is a great day for law enforcement.
But law enforcement was not finished with the mafia and the Genovese crime family. In 1991, another trial revealed that even New York City public housing was not immune to the ingenuity of the mob. When the Genovese family learned that the city was replacing millions of windows in all its vast housing projects, they got together with the other New York families and arranged to rig the bids.
They began either opening or acquiring. They'd buy a window business just so they can be in the bid rig and make $2 per window. And $2 doesn't sound like much, but when you multiply it by several $1 million of windows, that's a lot of money.
If a legitimate competitor tried to underbid the mob, it would force him out of the competition. They were able to do it because they controlled the union that the city used for window installation. The scheme was exposed when a Genovese associate named Peter Savino flipped and wore a government wire. From the Savino tapes, the government not only unraveled the windows plot, but was able to gather evidence that the real head of the crime family was now Vincent "Vinny the Chin" Gigante, the same gangster who had taken a shot at Frank Costello back in 1957. The FBI gave informant Peter Savino instructions to mention Gigante's name during a meeting with Gigante's alleged underboss, Venero Benny Mangano.
Peter quite innocuously turns and says, "How's Vincent?" And Benny goes nuts. "Don't use that name. How many times do you have to tell you, don't use that name? You know, you people listening, you don't know what's going on, you stop." It's just so telling that if this man wasn't the boss of the family, why would the underboss of the family be so concerned about the mere use of his name?
Benny Mangano was found guilty in the Windows trial. Gigante, on the other hand, was never tried. He claimed that he was insane. The court agreed and found him incompetent to stand trial. But most insiders insist that he is far from crazy. That in fact, he's been secretly running the family for many years and letting others, including Fat Tony Salerno, take the heat.
He's always been cagey, guileful, very suspicious of everyone, and he masterminded his own rise to fame.
That story is next, when we return. Scene from a comedy about organized crime. A reputed mafia boss, Vincent Gigante, wandering around Greenwich Village in a bathrobe, seemingly out of his mind.
He'll stop in the middle of the street and have a meaningless conversation with a telephone pole or parking meter, or just do crazy things.
At one point in the 80s, when the FBI tried to serve him with subpoena in his apartment, he ran naked into the shower, pulled out an umbrella, and turned on the shower.
And yet, Vinny the Chin became not only the symbol of a shrewd crime family, but of a man willing to do even the absurd to maintain his grip on the underworld.
Why does he allow himself to be debased and humiliated in public, looking like a destitute man or a deranged person and shuffling around the streets? And the bottom line is that he has a lust for power and he has a desire to stay out of prison.
A New York police detective once witnessed Gigante leaving his mother's apartment.
Out of the doorway comes Vincent Gigante in his pajamas and his bathrobe and his slippers. He gets into the Mercedes. All the windows are darkened. He gets out of that Mercedes a block and a half or maybe 2 blocks away, and he's dressed in a nice blue suit and he looks like $1 million.
In the 1990s, law enforcement developed a new picture of how the crime family had been operating for years. Vincent the Chin Gigante was wielding power from the shadows, while Fat Tony Salerno was playing the part of the boss, and even going to prison for it.
Part of the brilliance of the Genovese family has been their ability to camouflage who the true boss of the family is. So you have a period of time where the government tells you Fat Tony Salerno has been the boss of the family for a good number of years. Then you have people who were around Fat Tony and in the mob saying, you know, actually that isn't what was happening. What was happening was he was being held out as the boss. He was being held out almost as bait.
Vincent Gigante had grown up in the same part of Little Italy as Vito Genovese. Vito recruited him as a hitman and as his personal bodyguard, a quick way to the top in any crime family. In 1959, Gigante was convicted along with Genovese for drug trafficking.
He had 5 years in prison with Genovese, and it was probably the best schooling he ever got about how to be a boss.
In 1973, Gigante was charged with bribing the entire 5-member police department of Old Tappan, New Jersey, the small town where he lived at the time. Gigante was allegedly paying the cops to tell him when he was under surveillance. The charges were dropped after Gigante presented a hospital report indicating that he was insane. For years, the diagnosis stuck.
I mean, he is incompetent. As I said in one of my briefs, he's sick, sore, lame, and disabled mentally and also physically.
He sees animals, he sees trees. They talk to him, he talks back.
Though to many it was comical, Gigante's tactics seemed to pay off. After allegedly becoming boss, he instituted a policy within the family of total secrecy.
You're not allowed to speak his name if you're a member of the family. The only way you refer to him is that guy, and while you're doing that, rubbing your chin, because his nickname is the Chin. So even if you were to have surveillances or tape recorded conversations, you'd hear people saying, you know, I met with that guy. And you'd wonder, you know, who he's talking about.
By the mid-1990s, however, Gigante's acts began to wear thin, following testimony from cooperating witnesses.
There was one telling story where they were having a meeting of the high-ranking La Cosa Nostra members, and Vincent called it off because he said he was still a little woozy from the medication he had to take to continue his feigning insanity, and just postpone the meeting till his mind was clear.
By 1996, a federal judge found Gigante competent to stand trial. He pleaded not guilty to charges of racketeering and murder, including a plot to kill rival family boss John Gotti. Gigante allegedly felt Gotti had broken mob rules when he gunned down his predecessor, Paul Castellano, without the consent of the commission. In July 1997, Gigante was found guilty and sentenced to 12 years in prison. But the crime family begun by Lucky Luciano, though severely weakened by law enforcement, has not disappeared.
One of the reasons they probably will never be eliminated is that there's been a priority only in the last 15 years by the federal government in trying to uproot organized crime in America. And you know, sooner or later we lose government policies, government priorities change. And that's what I think the Mafia is banking on.
There have been new developments since this program first aired, all of which seem to spell the end of an era for the big crime families. In June 2002, the ever-defiant mob boss John Gotti died of cancer in a prison hospital. Then in April 2003, Vincent the Chin Gigante pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice, admitting in open court that he had faked his dementia for more than 2 decades. At 75, the former Oddfather was sentenced to an additional 3 years in prison. He died behind bars in December 2005. And finally, in October 2005, 4 reputed members of the Genovese crime family, including acting boss Dominic Cirillo, pleaded guilty to racketeering charges. The arrest